ดูอันนี้ Bayesian Network Fundamentals โจทย์มาโจทย์ละ Given the same model as above, each of these is an appropriate decomposition of joint distribution PA BCD ก็ PAB เนาะแล้วก็ C ขึ้นกับ AB แล้วก็ D ขึ้นกับ B อันนี้นะ D ไม่เกี่ยวนะ AB A B C D E อันนี้คืออะไร Independent Parameter Independent Parameter คืออะไร Conditional Distribution Conditional Probability Distribution of C โอเค C Define the C นะนี่ C ก็ขึ้นกับอะไรบ้างขึ้นกับ A กับ B ถูกปะแต่ว่าตัว C เนี่ยมีกี่อันถ้า C มี3 value ถูกไหมถ้า C มี3 value เนี่ยก็ขึ้นกับ A กับ B ทุกวิธีถูกไหม A กับ B มีทุกวิธีก็คือ2 คูณ 2เป็น4 วิธี given 4 วิธีตัว probability ของมันก็จะมีทั้งหมด3 ตัว3 ตัวนี้มันก็จะมีที่เป็นแบบ independent ก็คือแค่2 ตัวถูกไหมเพราะตัวที่3ก็ขึ้นกับตัวที่1ลบกับ probability ของตัวที่1กับตัวที่2ตัวโอเคเพราะมันก็ต้องมี2 คูณ 2เป็น4คูณกับ2เป็น8 4คูณ2ได้8ถูกไหมถูกนะ8นะถูกใช่ไหมแล้วสุดท้ายถามว่า intercausal reasoning นี่คือ V ใช่ไหม V structure precedent probability ของมี probability มาถึงก็คือ 0.01 ใช่ไหม probability ของ accident มีเกิด accident ขึ้นกับ 0.1 ทำให้เกิด traffic jam โดยที่ถ้าทั้งหมด4 วิธีเนาะ2 binary 2 คูณ 2เป็น4 2กำลัง2เป็น4 วิธีเป็น0 0 0 1 1 0 0 1 1ก็คือไม่มี precedent ฟิกเท่าไหร่ก็ 0.1 ไม่มี precedent มี accident traffic เท่าไหร่ก็ 0.5 precedent มาไม่มี accident traffic เท่าไหร่ 0.6 ติดแน่ถ้ามีทั้ง precedent และ accident ติดสุดๆติดแน่ๆอะไร 0.9 คือเกือบจะ1นะการติดก็สูงมากไม่เกิดอะไรก็ติด 10% ถ้าบ้านเราก็คงตรงนี้เป็น 0.9 ติดตลอดไม่ว่าจะมี accident หรือไม่มี precedent เราไม่มีเนาะเรามีแต่นายกตู่โอเค calculate P accident given traffic กับ P accident given traffic กับ precedent โอเคเราจะคำนวณมันยังไงแล้วก็ไปดูกันปึ้มอันนี้เขาจะถามว่าให้accident given traffic ถูกไหม accident given traffic เนี่ยหาได้ยังไงก็หาได้จากสูตรของ conditional probability ธรรมดาก็คือ PA given T ก็เท่ากับ PA และ T หารด้วย PT ถูกไหมอันนี้จอมันเล็กมองไม่เห็นเนาะดูหน่อยสิเต็มโอเคซูมเข้าไปมีสตรัคเจอร์ ดูกัน precedent car accident และ structure traffic jam pre accident เขาถามว่า pre accident เกิด accident given traffic เกิดถ้าเรารถติดเนี่ยจะมี accident เท่าไหร่ใช่ไหมมองเป็นเขาเรียก evidential reasoning ใช่ไหมเมื่อกี้มีอะไรบ้างนะจำไม่ได้ละจดกันหน่อย causal reasoningจำไม่ได้แล้วจดดูสิ causal reasoning มีอะไรบ้างมีเขาเรียกอะไรนะ reasoning pattern สิ reasoning pattern reasoning pattern ก็มี causal reasoning ใช่ causal reasoning ก็คือ x ไป y อย่างนี้ใช่ไหมมีอะไรนะ evidential reasoning แล้วก็ evidential reasoning คืออะไรก็คือแบบไป y แต่ว่านี้ก็คือแบบ influence กันได้ y influence x ได้ข้อ3ก็คือ intercausal ใช่ไหม intercausal reasoning อันนี้จะเป็น v structure x y w นะแล้วก็ถ้ารู้ w รู้ x ถ้ารู้ x เนี่ยปกติจะไม่เป็น y ถ้ารู้ w observe มันก็จะส่งผลต่อ y ได้มีคำว่าอะไรไหมที่ดูเมื่อกี้ active trail ใช่ไหม active trail แล้วก็ active trail คืออะไรก็เป็น x 1 x 2 x 3ส่งผลกันต่อเนื่องกันได้ใช่ปะแล้วก็จะถูกบล็อกอย่างเช่น x 1 อันนี้ active trail มันคือ x 1 influence อันนี้หรือใช่ไหมอันนี้ก็ได้ใช่ไหมอันนี้หรืออันนี้ก็ได้ใช่น่าจะเป็นหรือนะเสร็จแล้วอันนี้ถูกมี x 0มา active tail อันนี้ก็ไปได้เนาะก็เป็น x 0 x 1แต่ถ้าเรา observe ตัวนี้คือตัวนี้เป็นบล็อกมันบล็อก active tail เพราะว่าอันนี้เป็น v structure ถ้ามันไม่เป็น v structure มันก็บล็อกเนาะจะ activate เพราะว่าอะไรเพราะว่าสมมุติถ้า x 0เกิดเป็นสาเหตุ x 1 x 1เป็นสาเหตุ x 2ไม่สามารถพูดว่า x 3ต่อไม่ได้ถูกไหมแต่ว่าลงได้ถูกไหม x 0 x 1 x 2ลงเป็น x 6 x 5ได้แต่ว่าอันนี้ไม่ได้ขึ้นไม่ได้มันถูกบล็อกเพราะมันขึ้นไม่ได้ขึ้นภูเขานี้ไม่ได้เพราะว่ามันจนกว่าจะ activate v structure สมมติ x 5ที่เป็น v structure เหมือนกัน มัน restructure x 5ถ้ามันเป็น observe ขึ้นมามันจะ activate restructure ได้เราก็จะเห็นอะไรที่เป็น active tail อันนี้บ้างก็จะมี x 0 x 1เนาะ x 2 x 6 x 5ได้นะเพราะว่าแล้วก็ขึ้นไป x 4ได้ด้วยขึ้นไป x 4ขึ้นไป x 4ได้เพราะว่า observe แล้วมี activate restructure x 4ขึ้นไป x 3ได้ไหมได้ x 4ขึ้นไป x 3ได้ x 3ลงไป x 2ได้ไหมได้เพราะว่าถึงแม้ไม่ observe ก็สามารถไปได้โอเคทีนี้อะไรทำให้เราเห็นว่ามันจะถูกบล็อกได้ที่ x 2ไป x 3ไม่ได้เราก็เลยมีค่ะข้อสรุปเกี่ยวกับตัวที่อยู่ตรงกลางก็คือ x influence y ได้ไหมโดยที่ w เป็นสมาชิกของ z ไม่เป็นสมาชิกของ z แล้วเป็นสมาชิกของ z โดยที่ z เป็น random variable ของ observe ถ้าเป็นแพทเทิร์นแบบ x w y x w y x w y x ไป w ไป y โอเคถ้า x ไม่ได้ถูก observe w ไม่ถูก observe x ไป w ไป y ได้ไหมก็ดูจากข้างบนก็ได้นะ x 0 x 1 x 2ใช่ไหมในข้างบน x 0 x 1 x 2แสดงว่าได้ x 0 x 1 x 2แปลว่าได้แต่ถ้า w observe แล้วถ้า w ถูก observe แล้วมันก็ w เนี่ยจะส่งผลต่อ y แน่นอนถูกไหมครับ w observe แต่ว่า x จะส่งผลต่อ y ไหมจะไม่แล้วเพราะว่าสาเหตุเนี่ยไอเนี่ยจะเป็นอะไรก็ได้เพราะ w เรารู้แล้วว่ามันเป็นส่งผลต่อ y แต่ x เนี่ยเป็นอะไรก็เป็นไปเถอะเพราะว่าเรารู้ว่า w แล้วเพราะว่า x ไม่ได้ส่งผลต่อ y โดยตรงถูกไหมเพราะงั้นน่ะสิ่งนี้ก็ไม่สามารถ x ไม่อินฟลูเอนซ์ต่อ y อันที่สองต่อมา w ตรงนี้ใช่ไหม x ส่งผลต่อ y ไหมก็ดูจากอันนี้ก็ได้ x 4ส่งผลต่อ x 3เนาะ x 5ส่งผลต่อ x 4ส่งผลต่อ x 3เพราะว่า influence ขึ้นไปได้เพราะงั้นอันนี้ได้แน่ๆแต่ถ้า w เนี่ยมัน observe แล้วถ้า w observe แล้วปุ๊บ x ก็ไม่สามารถที่จะส่งผลอะไรต่อ w ได้เลยถูกไหมเพราะว่า x มันถูกส่งผลต่อ w ใช่ไหมแต่ว่า x w จะไม่ถูกเปลี่ยนเพราะงั้น y ก็ที่ขึ้นอยู่กับ w แน่ๆใช่ไหมถ้า w y ขึ้นกับ w แน่ๆกับ x ไม่เกี่ยวแล้ว x จะเป็นอะไรก็แล้วแต่มันเหมือนข้อที่แล้วต่อไปคือ w ทำให้เกิด x แล้วก็ y ถูกไหมก็คิดถึงอันไหนนะมีไหมในแพทเทิร์นด้านบนไม่มีนะ ไม่มีอ่ะเดี๋ยวไม่มีแต่มี x 3 x 3 x 3 x 3สามารถแตกนี่ x 3แตกเป็น x 2 x 4ได้ก็นี่ได้แน่ๆแต่ว่าถ้า x 3มันรู้แล้วได้แน่ๆเพราะว่า x 4เนี่ยส่งผลไปถึง x 2 x 4ส่งผล x 2ได้เห็นไหมอันเนี้ย x 4ส่งผลถึง x 2ได้เพราะงั้นอันนี้ได้แต่ว่าถามว่าถ้า x 3รู้แล้ว x 4จะส่งผลไป x 2ไหมอันนี้ก็จะไม่เพราะว่า x 3มันรู้ละ x 3มันรู้ละเพราะงั้นมันก็จะไม่ส่งผลไปต่อที่ x 4x 3ก็จะส่งผลต่อไป x 4และ x 3ส่งผลต่อ x 2แต่ x 2จะไม่มีผลอะไร x 4ถ้าเป็นอันนี้ x y ไป w ก็ x ดู x 1 x 3ไป x 2กับ x 6 x 4ไป x 5 x 1 x 3ไป x 2นี่มีผลไหมก็ถ้า w เนี่ยไม่ observe ถามว่า x มีผลต่อ y ไหมคือ x 1มีผลต่อ x 3ไหม x 1มีผลต่อ x 3ไหมไม่มีเพราะว่า x 1กับ x 3เป็นสาเหตุของ x 2 x 1เปลี่ยนก็ไม่ทำให้ x 3เปลี่ยนเพราะงั้นไม่มีแต่ถ้า w ถ้า wf ถูก observe หมายความว่า x 2ถูก observe ถ้า x 2ถูก observe แล้ว x 2รู้ว่ามันเป็นใช่หรือไม่ใช่อย่างนี้นะพอ x 1เปลี่ยนก็จะทำให้ x 3เปลี่ยนด้วยก็คือ x 1ส่งผลต่อ x 3อันนี้ถูกต้องโอเคสิ่งที่ได้มาอีกอันนึงก็คือ chain rule จากบทแรกมี chain rules มาดู chain rules กัน chain rules chain rules คืออะไรเอารูปเดิมนะเนาะรูปเดิมดีกว่า chain rule เอารูปเดิมรูปไหนรูป x เหมือนเดิมนะเนาะchain rule เอารูป x เหมือนเดิมโอเค chain rules ก็คือถ้าเราต้องการหา probability ของอะไรดี x 0เท่ากับสักอย่าง x 1เท่ากับสักอย่าง x 2เท่ากับสักอย่าง x 3เท่ากับสักอย่างจะคิดยังไงแล้วก็ใช้ probability ของ x 0คูณกับ probability ของ x 3คูณกับ probability conditional probability x 1 given x 0และก็ probability ของ x 2 given x 1แล้วก็ x 3 chain rules โอเคไว้ใช้ทำอะไรก็คือใช้ในข้อนี้เองต่อไป decimal fundamental ก็ถ้าจะคิด p accident เท่ากับ1 given traffic เท่ากับ1ก็จะได้เท่ากับ probability ของ accident เท่ากับ1และ traffic เท่ากับ1หารด้วย probability ของ traffic เท่ากับ1ก็จะเท่ากับ probability ของ a เท่ากับ1 p เท่ากับ1ก็คือเท่ากับ probability a เท่ากับ1 p เท่ากับ1 p เท่ากับ0บวกกับ p ของ a เท่ากับ1 p เท่ากับ1 p เท่ากับ1หารด้วยทุกวิธีของที่ t เท่ากับ1ก็คือทั้งหมดนั้น t 1ก็คือ a 0 p 0 a 0 p 1 a 1 p 0แล้วก็ a 1 p 1ทั้งหมดนี้ก็คือคำนวณได้ด้วย chain rules ออกมาเป็น 0.35 อันต่อมาก็ตรวจคล้ายๆกันผลออกมาเป็น 0.14 กับ 0.35 เราไปตอบกันเถอะ 0.35 ถูกไหมนะ ย้ถูกแล้วเย้ได้100% keep running โอเคบทต่อมาเป็นเรื่องของ Bayesian Network Independency คืออะไรไม่รู้อะมี conditional dependency in Bayesian Network แล้วก็ naive Bayes นี่ก็ขึ้นกับ independent เหมือนกันเนาะเป็น conditional independent อ๋อนี่ไงก็ conditional independent ก็ naive Bayes ใช่ไหมเพราะว่า naive Bayes assumption แรกของมันก็คือเป็น conditional independent เรียนเลย
So far, we've defined graphical models primarily as a data structure for distribution. So we talked about how you can take a probability distribution and using a set of parameters that are somehow tied to the graph structure, one can go ahead and represent a
ใส่หูฟังกันหน่อยดีกว่า
probability distribution over a high-dimensional space in a factored form. It turns out that one can view the graph structure in a graphical model using a completely complementary viewpoint, which is as a representation of the set of independencies that the probability distribution must satisfy. That view turns out to be really enlightening and thought-provoking, and so let's talk about that. And we're going to begin by just defining the notion of independencies that we're going to utilize in subsequent presentations. So let's start by just defining the very basic notion of independence within a probability distribution. And initially, we're just going to talk about the probability, the independence of events, alpha and beta, within a probability distribution. And let me just go ahead and introduce this notation. This says P, the symbol, is the logical symbol for satisfies. And this perpendicular symbol is a standard notation for independence. Okay, so this says P satisfies alpha is independent of beta. That's how one should read that statement. And there's actually three entirely equivalent definitions of the concept of independence. The first one says that the probability of the conjunction of the two events, so there's several different ways to denote conjunction. Some people denote it as intersection. We typically denote it using a comma. So here is the probability of alpha and beta holding both is simply the probability of alpha times the probability of beta. That's the first definition. The second definition is a definition about flow of influence. And this says, if you tell me beta, it doesn't affect my probability in alpha. So the probability of alpha, given the information about beta, is the same as the probability of alpha if you don't give me that information. And because probabilistic influence is symmetrical, we also have the exact converse of that. That is, the probability of beta given alpha is the same as the probability of beta. So this is independence of events, and you can take that exact same definition and generalize it to independence of random variables. So here we're going to read this in the exact same way. This says P satisfies X is independent of Y for two random variables X and Y. And once again, we have the exact same set of definitions. So the first one says that P of X comma Y is equal to P of X times P of Y. The second says that P of X given Y is equal to P of X, and P of Y given X is equal to P of Y. You can read these three statements in two different but equivalent forms. The first is as a universal statement. So, for example, you could read the first statement as saying for every assignment little x and little y to the variables x and y, we have that P of the event x comma y is equal to P of x times P of y. So you can think of it as a conjunction of lots and lots of independent statements of the form over here. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation is as an expression over factors. That is, this one tells me that the factor over here, which is the joint distribution over x and y, is actually a product of two lower dimensional factors, one which is a factor whose scope is x, and one is a factor whose scope is y. These are all equivalent definitions, but each of them has a slightly different intuition, so it's useful to recognize all of them. Okay. So let's take an example of independence. Here is a fragment of our student's network. It has three random variables: intelligence, difficulty, and course grade. And this is a probability distribution that has a scope over three variables, but we can go ahead and marginalize that to get a probability distribution over the scope, which is a factor over the scope ID. As it happens, this is the marginal distribution, which you can confirm for yourselves by just adding up the appropriate entries. So just as a reminder, to get I0, D0, we're going to add up this one, and that one, and that's going to give us this factor. And it's not difficult to test that if we then go ahead and marginalize P of I comma D to get P of I and P of D, that P of I comma D is the product of these two factors. So here's an example of a distribution that satisfies an independence property. And here's the graphical model, and when you look at it, you can see that there's no direct connections between I and D, and we'll talk later about how that tells us that there's no, that these two are actually independent in this distribution. Now, independence by itself is not a particularly powerful notion because it happens only very rarely. That is, only in very few cases are you going to have random variables that are truly independent of each other. At least few interesting cases. You can always construct examples. So now we're going to define a much broader notion of much greater usefulness, which is the notion of conditional independence. Conditional independence, which applies equally well to random variables or to set of random variables, is written like this. So here we have, once again, that P satisfies. Here we have, again, the independence sign. But here we have a conditioning sign. And this is read as P satisfies X is independent of Y given Z. Okay? And once again, we have three equivalent definitions of this property. The first says that probability of X comma Y given Z is equal to the product of P of X given Z times the probability of Y given Z. Once again, you can view this as a universally quantified statement over all possible values of X, Y, and Z, or as a product of factors. Definition number 2 is a definition of information flow. Given Z, Y gives me no additional information that changes my probability in X. Or, given Z, X gives me no additional information that changes my probability in Y. Once again, this is you can view this as an expression involving factors. Notice that this is very analogous to the definitions that we had for just plain old independence. Z effectively never moves. It always sits there on the right-hand side of the conditioning bar and never moves. And so if you find yourself having a hard time remembering conditional independence, just remember that the thing you're conditioning on just sits there on the right-hand side of the conditioning bar all the time. Let me introduce one final definition, which is going to serve us quite well in an interesting derivation. It's very similar to the first definition, but it says that the probability of x comma y comma z, the joint distribution, is proportional to, so we're going to forget the potential need to add normalizing constant. It's proportional to a product of two factors, one factor over x and z, and one factor over y and z. Okay? This turns out to be yet another definition of conditional independence. Let's look at an example of conditional independence. Imagine that you have, that I give you two coins, and I'm telling you that one of those coins is fair, and the other one is biased, and it's going to come up heads 90% of the time. But they look the same. So now you have a process by which you first pick a coin out of my hand, and then you toss it twice. So this is which coin you pick, and this is the two tosses. Now, let's think about dependence and independence in this example. If you don't know which coin you picked, and you toss the coin and it comes out heads, what happens to the probability of heads in the second toss? Be higher, right? Because if it came out heads the first time, that is more likely to happen. I mean, it happens 50-50 with a fair coin, but it also happens with greater probability with the biased coin. And so the probability of having heads in the second toss is going to be higher now. On the other hand, if I now tell you, no, you picked the fair coin, you don't really care what the outcome of the first toss is. It doesn't tell you anything about the probability of the second toss. Similarly, if I tell you that it's the biased coin, it also doesn't tell you anything at that point. The first toss and the second toss are no longer correlated. And so what we have is that x1 and x2 are not independent, so P does not satisfy x1 is independent of x2, but we have that P does satisfy x1 is independent of x2 given C. So here's a very simple and intuitive example of conditional independence. Let's go back to another example of conditional independence, one in the distribution that we've seen before. This is actually a very analogous model because it also has, in this case, one common cause, which is, this case, is the student's intelligence. This is in the student example that we've seen before. We have two things that emanate from that, the student's grade in the course and their SAT scores. And once again, it's you can generate the joint distribution ISG, which is this. And now you can look at the probability of S and G given, for example, I0, and ask yourselves, how does that decompose, and is that independent given when we look at the probability of S given I0 and the probability of G given I0. And convince yourselves that in this case conditional.
We have shown that PST given I0 เท่ากับ PS given I0 คูณกับ PT given I0. In this case, to check if S and J are conditionally independent given I, do we still need to check if probability of SG given I1 and equal to PS given I1 probability given I1? Yes. yes we need to check ต้องเช็คว่า independence จริงทุกค่า i เพราะว่า statement บอกว่า sg conditional independent given i not that they are conditional independent given i 0 ทุก i นะฮะ i 0 i 1
independence applies. Now, one somewhat counterintuitive property of independence that you kind of don't think about when you hear about conditional independencies the first time is that conditioning on something doesn't just gain you independencies, as it did in the case of the coin or in the case of the intelligence, but rather conditioning can also lose independencies.
Which of the following independent statements are true for the student network? PID given G ก็คือ grade ถ้าเรารู้ grade แล้ว I กับ D I given G กับ D given G จะ independent กันกับ SG given I PS given I PT given I ถ้า I เกิดขึ้นมาแล้วอันนี้ถูกแน่นอนใช่ไหม I กับ D นี่แน่นอน S กับ G ไม่แน่แต่เนี้ยแน่แต่เนี้ยไม่อันนี้ล่ะแต่อันเนี้ย I ขึ้นกับ G ถูกไหม influence by G แล้วค่อย influence by D ด้วยนะจริงๆแล้วแต่ว่าถ้ามันเกิด G ปุ๊บ I กับ D ก็จะกับ G แล้ว I ขึ้นกับ G เท่านั้นไม่ขึ้นกับ D ไม่น่านะนี่ไม่แน่ใจคิดว่าไม่ใช่คิดว่าถูกแค่2อันเนี้ยเพราะว่าอันเนี้ยมันสมมติถ้า G มัน given G ใช่ไหมถ้ามัน D มันได้มันก็ต้องเปลี่ยน I ด้วยใช่ไหมแต่ถ้า I มันได้ก็ต้องเปลี่ยน D ด้วยแต่เราพร้อมกันเลยเนาะมัน PID given G เนาะหรือถูกวะเอา2อันนี้กันโอเค SG are dependent SG are dependent but conditionally given I โอเคก่อนตอน flow I and D are independent โอเคถูก but conditionally dependent given G ก็คือ activate V structure I and D independent คืออันนี้แต่ว่ากลายเป็น dependent ขึ้นมาเลยถ้าเรารู้ G กลายเป็น dependent ขึ้นมาเพราะงั้นอันนี้ผิดก็เหมือนที่พูดเมื่อกี้ก็คือว่าถ้า G รู้ปุ๊บถ้า D เปลี่ยน I เปลี่ยนถ้า I เปลี่ยน D เปลี่ยนไม่ dependent ต่อไปแต่ว่าถ้า D เปลี่ยน I ไม่เปลี่ยนอยู่แล้วโดยปกติ I เปลี่ยน D ไม่เปลี่ยนอยู่แล้ว G เปลี่ยน S เปลี่ยนถ้า G เปลี่ยน S เปลี่ยนแน่ S เปลี่ยน G เปลี่ยนแต่ว่าถ้ารู้ I ปุ๊บ G เปลี่ยน S ไม่เปลี่ยนละ S เปลี่ยน G ไม่เปลี่ยนละโอเค
So this is the other fragment of our student network where we had the intelligence and the difficulty both influencing the grade. And we have already seen that although I and D are independent in the original distribution, they're not independent when we condition on grade. So this is a case where, and you can just convince yourselves of this by examining this distribution over here, that I and D are not independent in this conditional distribution, even though they were in the marginal distribution.
โอ้โหอีก18 นาทีนะครับถึง30 นาทีแล้วก็อีก10 นาที
One of the most elegant properties of probabilistic graphical models is the intricate connection between the factorization of the distribution as a product of factors and the independence properties that it needs to satisfy. Now we're going to talk about how that connection manifests in the context of directed graphical models or Bayesian networks. So let's first remind ourselves about why independence and factorization are related to each other. So for example, the independence definition that P of x comma y is the product of two factors, P of x and P of y, is the definition of independence, and at the same time, it's a factorization of the joint distribution as a product of two factors. Similarly, one of the definitions that we gave for conditional independence, which is that the joint distribution over x, y, and z is a factor over x and z times a factor over y and z, is the definition of conditional independence. So once again, independence and factorization. So we see that factorization of the distribution corresponds to independencies that hold in that distribution. And the question is, if we have that, if we know now that a distribution P factorizes over G, the question is, can we know something about the independencies that the distribution P must satisfy just by looking at the structure of the graph G? So what are independencies that that might hold in a probabilistic graphical model? So we talked about the notion of flow of influence in a probabilistic graphical model, where we have, for example, the notion of an active trail that goes through S, up through I, down through G, and up through D, if, for example, we have that G is observed, that is, in Z. And that gave us an intuition about when probabilistic influence might flow. We can now turn this notion on its head and ask the question, well, what happens when we tell you that there are no active trails in the graph? That is, influence can't flow. So we're going to make that notion formal using the notion of deseparation. And we're going to say that x and y are deseparated in a graph G given a set of observations Z if there's no active trail between them. And the intuition that we'd like to demonstrate in this context is that this notion of influence can't flow corresponds much more formally to the rigorous notion of conditional independence in the graph.
แป๊บนะ งง ขอไปดู อันนี้ใหม่
The intuition that
ความหมายคือ x, y deseparated in G given C if there is no active trail in G between x and y given C. ลองทำดูแล้วกัน
rigorous notion of conditional independence in a graph.
DJ ปึ้งไปกันได้ถูกไหม given L H Iถามว่า D กับ J เนี่ยมันยังส่งผลถึงกันหรือเปล่าถ้ารู้ L H กับ I ไม่รู้เหมือนกันมาดูดิ D ไปอันนี้ไปได้ไหมขึ้นได้ไหมถ้าต้องรู้ G ถึงขึ้นได้ถูกไหมอันนี้ลงได้ถูกไหมต้องรู้ H ถึงขึ้นได้ถูกไหมต้องเป็น V structure รู้ H ปุ๊บโอเคขึ้นได้นะขึ้นถึงจบแสดงว่าถึงลงนี่ติดอันนี้ติด L นี้ไม่ได้อยู่ละยังได้อยู่แสดงว่าไม่ to separate ถ้า d ไป i given l d ไป i d ไป i นี่ถูกไหมโดยมี l ละเพราะงั้นเราไปอันนี้ขึ้นไม่ได้อยู่แล้ว เพราะว่ามันติดอันนี้ไม่รู้แต่ลงอันนี้ได้ถูกไหมแล้วก็ขึ้นไม่ได้ด้วยตอนนี้เนี่ย separate เป็น true d separation อันนี้ dj given l d ไป j given l อย่างเดียวอันนี้ขึ้นไม่ได้อันนี้ขึ้นไม่ได้ถูกอันนี้ถูกอันนี้ลงไปก็ติด l dj given l กับ i อันนี้ลงขึ้นไม่ได้ถูกไหมลงก็ไม่ได้อันนี้ก็ขึ้นไม่ได้นี่ได้เหมือนกันอ้าวผิดเหรอโอเคมาดูกัน dj given l กับ i เป็น only statement that true นะ if we observe l the b structure g is อ้าวอ๋อ I forget the we activate that can be the descendant of that node คือ G อ่ะมันถึงไม่ต้อง activate ก็ได้แต่ L มัน activate เพราะ L activate ตัว B structure ได้เหมือนกันเพราะว่า L อ่ะมันส่งผลต่อ G ถูกไหมเพราะงั้น G มันก็คือรู้ละเพราะว่า L ส่งผลต่อ G มันก็รู้ละรู้ปุ๊บ D มันมาถึงมันก็ไป I ได้ใช่ไหมลืมโอเคคือมันส่งผลไปถึงนี่ได้เพราะว่า L มัน activate นี่ได้ก็คือว่า L มันเปลี่ยนความน่าจะเป็นของเกรดไปตอนแรกเกรดเราไม่รู้เลยถูกไหม L มันเปลี่ยนความน่าจะเป็นของเกรดไปพอเกรดมันพอรู้แล้วว่ามันน่าจะห่วยนะพอน่าจะห่วยปุ๊บถ้าเนี่ยมันยากขึ้นมา intelligence ก็เริ่มจะเปลี่ยนละoh I forget this I need to remind this a lot โอเคเข้าใจละ
So let's actually prove that that's in fact the case. So
d separated เมื่อกี้มีคำว่าอะไรบ้างเนี่ยต้องจดไว้หน่อยจดหน่อยแล้วนี่เป็นเรื่องของ independenceจดอะไรบ้างพูดหน่อยกี้มีเรื่อง independence กับ factorization ถูกไหมโอเคเรากลับไปอันที่แล้วจดหน่อยจด independent เมื่อกี้น่าจะจดอะไรบ้างเอา difficulty ก่อนความฉลาดความเก่งใช่ไหม intelligent ส่งผลต่อเกรดส่งผลต่อคะแนน SAT recommender ดีนี่อะไรนะ difficulty อะไร independent กันบ้าง D independent กับ I G independent ไม่ G given I independent กับ s given i ถูกป่ะอะไรอีก p d given g อันนี้ไม่ independent กับ p i given g อะไรอีก p g ไม่ independent กับ ps ตัวแล้วก็มีอะไรที่ต้องจดอีกก็มีเรื่องของdeseparation นิยามก่อน definition ว่า x และ y are deseparated in graph G given C if there is no active trail in G between x and y given C notation ของมันเนี่ยจะใช้ว่า d sep ในกราฟ G ของ x y given C แล้วก็จดลองวาดรูปกราฟดูดีไหมวาดรูปกราฟดู
conditional independence in a graph.
วาดรูปกราฟดูโอเคอันนี้d sep อะไรบ้าง d sep C ไป J เนาะ J ตัวใหญ่แล้วกันนะ given อะไร separate ได้ดูกันอันนี้ไปได้ไปได้ไปได้ติดถูกบล็อกถ้ามี h เนาะบล็อกได้ต้องมี h
So let's actually go more formally to the rigorous notion of conditional independence in a graph.
มีบล็อกด้วยตัวมันอันนี้ไปได้อยู่แล้วเกรดลงมาอุ๊ยลงมาได้ถึง J แน่นี่ขึ้นไม่ได้เป็น V structure ขึ้นไม่ได้เพราะงั้นเกรดนี่ไม่ได้แฮปปี้ไม่ได้แน่ อันนี้ขึ้นไม่ได้จะลงได้ทำไงให้ตัดลงได้ก็คือต้องเป็นเกรดสมมุติถ้าเป็นเกรดถ้าเป็นเกรดถ้าเป็นสีเขียวถ้าเป็นเกรดสมมติเกรดมัน observe ถ้าเกรด observe ปุ๊บอันนี้จะขึ้นแทนลงแล้วก็ลงเพราะฉะนั้นต้องมีเพิ่มอีกตัวหนึ่งก็คือตัดตอนอันนี้ก็คือต้องเป็นต้องมีซัดด้วยถึงจะได้ถูกไหมถึงจะตัดตอนมันได้หรือว่า d set cj given สมมติเอาเป็นสีดำแล้วกันนะ l l l กับอะไร i ก็ได้นะ l กับ i ก็ได้เพราะว่า l สมมุติถ้า l observe มันจะส่งผลขึ้นไปทำให้เกิด reactivate reactivate activate restructure activate restructure i ตัดที่ตัด i ก็ได้ตัด s ก็ได้เนาะโอเค
So let's actually prove that that's in fact the case. So
กลับมาเรียนต่อ กลับมา ไปเรียนต่อ
The theorem that we'd like to state that if P factorizes over the graph, if P factorizes over G, and we have a deseparation property that holds in the graph, so X and Y are deseparated in the graph, there's no active trails between them, then P satisfies the conditional independence statement, X is independent of Y given Z. So deseparation implies independence if the probability distribution factorizes over G. So we're not going to prove the theorem in its full glory. We're going to prove it by example because that example really does illustrate the main points of the derivation. So the assumption, so here's our graph G, and here's the factorization of the distribution. So according to the chain rule of Bayesian networks, and this is a factorization that we've seen before. And so now we'd like to prove that a deseparation statement follows from this assumption. And the deseparation statement that we'd like to prove follows as an independence is one that says that D is independent of S. First, let's convince ourselves that D and S are in fact deseparated in this graph. And so we see that there is only one possible trail between D and S in this graph. It goes like that. And since G is not observed in this case, and neither is L, we have the trail is not activated, and so the two nodes are deseparated, and so we'd like to prove that this independence holds. So what is the joint probability distribution of D and S? Well, it's the sum over this joint distribution over here, marginalizing out the three variables that are not D and S, so G, L, and I. So we have the sum over G, L, and I of this big product that's defined by the chain rule. And as we've previously seen, when we have a summation like that, one of the things that we can do is we can push in summations into the product so long as we don't push them through terms that involve the variable. So here, for example, we might have a summation over L. And we can push in that summation because the only term that involves L is probability of L given G. So if we push in the summations in this way, we end up with the following expression, and we see that we have this summation over L here, a summation over G, and then finally the summation over I at the very beginning. And what do we know about the summation over L of P of L given G? We know that this is a probability distribution over L, and therefore it's necessarily sums to 1 because we're summing up over all of the possible values of L. Once this term is 1, we can look at the next term, which is this one, and we can ask ourselves, well, 1 is cancelled out, and so probability, what is the sum over G of the probability of G given D and I, and that 2 is 1. And by the time we're done, we end up with the following expression, and the important thing to notice about this expression is that this is phi 1 of D.
อะไรคือ summation ของทุก i อ๋ออันนี้มันคือ pi คูณกับ ps given i ก็คือ ps และก็ i ถูกไหมถ้า ps และ i เนี่ยทุก i ก็คือ marginalize ถูกไหมก็คือเป็น ps
And this is phi 2 of S. And therefore, because we partition this joint distribution as a product of two factors, we end up with something that corresponds directly to the definition of marginal dependence, therefore proving that P satisfies this independence statement. So having convinced ourselves that deseparation is an interesting notion, let's look at some other deseparation statements that might hold in a graph. So one general statement that we can show is that any node in the graph is deseparated from its non-descendants given its parents. So let's look at the variable letter, and let's see what non-descendants it has that are not its parents. So it only has two descendants. Let's mark those in blue. It's this one and that one. And what are the non-descendants? So these are the descendants. What about the non-descendants? Well, here's one non-descendant. Here's another, another, and another. So those are the four non-descendants in the graph that are not parents. So now let's convince ourselves that letter is deseparated from all of its non-descendants given its parents. And let's take just an arbitrary one of those. Let's take SAT, for example. And let's see if we can find an active trail from SAT to letter that is active given the parents, which in this case is just the variable grade. Okay, so what's one potential trail? So we can go this way, up, and then back down through letter. But is that trail active? No, it's not active because grade is observed, and so it blocks the trail, as in fact it will block any trail that comes in from the top. So any trail into letter that comes in through its parent grade is going to be blocked by the fact that grade is observed. So that means we have to come in through the bottom. So let's look at that. So let's look at the trail from SAT through job and up again through letter. Well, is that trail active? No. The reason it's not active is because only grade is observed, and job, since it can't be a parent of letter because it's a descendant, is necessarily not observed, and so neither job nor happy are observed, and so we cannot activate this V structure over here, cannot be activated, and so trails that come in from the bottom don't work either. And so again, this is a proof by demonstration, but it shows, again, that it shows the general property in a very simple way. So that tells us, by the theorem that we proved on the previous slide, that if P factorizes over G, then we know that any variable is independent of its non-descendants given its parents. Which is kind of a nice intuition when you think about it, because when we motivated the structure of Bayesian networks, we basically said that what makes us pick the parents for a node is the set of variables that are the only ones that this variable depends on. So the parents of X are the variables on which X depends directly. And this gives a formal semantics to that intuition. That is, we now have that the variable is depending only on its parents. So now, so from the bottom, and job blocked by the fact that grade is observed. So that means we have to come in through the bottom. So let's look at that. So let's look at the trail from SAT through job and up again through letter. Well, is that trail active? No. The reason it's not active is because only grade is observed, and job, since it can't be a parent of letter because it's a descendant, is necessarily not observed, and so neither job nor happy are observed, and so we cannot activate this V structure over here, cannot be activated, and so trails that come in from SAT to letter, so these are the descendants, non-descendants, given its to fact that some other deseparation, the deseparation is that P satisfies. From these independence statements, we can dependence, therefore proving that P satisfies this independence statement. So having convinced ourselves that deseparation is an interesting notion, let's look at some other deseparation statements that might hold in a graph. So one general statement that we can show is that any node in the graph is deseparated from its non-descendants given its parents. So let's look at the variable letter, And let's see what non-descendants it has that are not its parents. So it only has 2 descendants. Let's mark those in blue. It's this one and that one. And what are the non-descendants? So these are the descendants. What about the non-descendants? Well, here's one non-descendant. Here's another, another, and another. So those are the 4 non-descendants in the graph that are not parents. So now let's convince ourselves that letter is deseparated from all of its non-descendants given its parents. And let's take just an arbitrary one of those. Let's take SAT, for example. And let's see if we can find an active trail from SAT to letter that is active given the parents, which in this case is just the variable grade. Okay, so what's one potential trail? So we can go this way, up,
เหมือนบล็อกพ่อแม่ปุ๊บ
and then
มัน
back
ก็มาไม่ได้
down through letter. But is that trail active? No, it's not active because grade is observed, and so it blocks the trail, as in fact it will block any trail that comes in from the top. So any trail into letter that comes in through its parent grade is going to be blocked by the fact that grade is observed. So that means we have to come in through the bottom. So let's look at that. So let's look at the trail from SAT through job and up again through letter. Well, is that trail active? No. The reason it's not active is because only grade is observed, and job, since it can't be a parent of letter because it's a descendant, is necessarily not observed, and so neither job nor happy are observed, and so we cannot activate this V structure over here, cannot be activated, and so trails that come in from the bottom don't work either. And so again, this is a proof by demonstration, but it shows again that that it shows the general property in a very simple way. So that tells us, by the theorem that we proved on the previous slide, that if P factorizes over G, then we know that any variable is independent of its non-descendants given its parents, which is kind of a nice intuition when you think about it, because when we motivated the structure of Bayesian networks, we basically said that what makes us pick the parents for a node is the set of variables that are the only ones that this variable depends on. So the parents of X are the variables on which X depends directly. And this gives a formal semantics to that intuition. That is, we now have that the variable is depending only on its parents. So now that we've defined a set of independencies that hold for any distribution that factorizes over a graph, we're now going to define a general notion, which is just a term for this. So we define deseparation in a graph G, and we showed that when you have the deseparation property, that P satisfies the corresponding independence statement. And so now we can basically look at the independencies that are implied by the graph G. So I of G, which is the set of independencies that are implicit in a graph G, are all of the independence statements X is independent of Y given Z, that correspond to these separation statements in the graph. So this is the set of all independencies that are derived from these separation statements. And those are the ones that the graph implies hold for distribution P, as we just showed in the previous theorem. So now we can give this a name. We're going to say that P, if P satisfies all of the independencies in G, then G is an IMAP of P. And IMAP stands for independency map. And the reason it's an independency map is by looking at G, it's a map of independencies that hold in P. That is, it maps independencies that we know to be true. So let's look at an example for independence. Independency map. And the reason it's an independency map is by looking at G, it's a map of independencies that hold in P. That is, it maps independencies that we know to be true. So let's look at an example of an IMAP. So let's look at two distributions. Here's one distribution P1, and here's a second distribution P2. And let's look at two possible graphs. One is G1 that has D and I being separate variables, and the other is G2 that has an edge between D and I. So what independencies does G1 imply? What's an I of G1? Well, I of G1 is the independence that says D is independent of I, because there's no edges between them. What's I of G2? Well, I of G2 implies no independencies, because because D and I are connected by an edge and there's no other independencies that can be implied, and so I of G2 is the empty set. So what does that tell us? Let's look at the connection between these graphs and these two distributions. Is G1 an IMAP of P1? Well, if you look at P1, you can convince yourselves that P1 satisfies D is independent of I. G1 is an IMAP of P1. What about is G1 an IMAP of P2? Well, if we look at P2, we can again convince ourselves by examination that P2 doesn't satisfy D is independent of I. So the answer is no. This G1 is not an IMAP for P2. What about the other direction? What about G2? Well, G2 has no independence assumptions. And so it satisfies, and so both P1 and P2 satisfy the empty set of independence assumptions. As it happens, P1 also satisfies additional independence assumptions, but the definition of IMAP didn't require that, that a graph exactly represent the independencies in a distribution. Only that any independence that's implied by the graph holds for the distribution. And so we have that G2 is actually an IMAP for both P1 and P2. So now we can restate the theorem that we stated before. Before we talked about these separation properties, so now we can just give it a one concise statement. We can say that if P factorizes over G, that is, if it's representable as a Bayesian network over G, then G is an IMAP for P, which means I can read from G independencies that hold in P regardless of the parameters. Just by knowing that P factorizes over G. Interestingly, the converse of this theorem holds also. So this version of the theorem says that if G is an IMAP for P, then P factorizes over G. So what does that mean? It means that if the distribution satisfies the independence assumptions that are implicit in the graph, then we can take that distribution and represent it as a Bayesian network over that graph. So once again, let's do a proof by example. So now here we have the little graph that we're going to use, and so now what do we know? We're going to write down the probability of the joint distribution over these 5 random variables using this expression, which is the chain rule for probabilities, not the chain rule for Bayesian networks, because we don't know yet that this is representable as a Bayesian network. We're going to write the chain rule for probabilities, and that has us writing it as P of D times P of I given D, which if you multiply the two together using the definition of conditional probability, these two together give us probability of I comma D. If we multiply that by G given I and D, then we end up with a probability of G comma I comma D, and so on. We can construct this telescoping product, and altogether by multiplying all these conditional probabilities, we can reconstruct the original joint probability distribution. Great, now what? So we haven't used any notions of independence yet, so where do we use that? Well, we're going to look at each one of these terms and we're going to see how we can simplify it. So P of D is already as simple as it gets. So now let's look at the next term, which is probability of I given D. And let's look at this graph, and we can see that I and D are non-descendants, and we're not conditioning on any parents. And so we have that in this graph, and we've already shown this, that I is independent of D. And so we can, using one of the definitions that we have of conditional independence, we can erase this from the right-hand side of the conditioning bar and just get P of I. The next term is actually already in the form that we wanted, so we don't need to do anything with it. But now let's look at the probability of S given D, I, and G. So here we have the probability of a variable S given one of its parents I and 2 non-descendants, D and G. And we know that S is independent of its non-descendants given its parent I, and so we can erase both D and G and just end up with probability of S given I. Finally, we have the last term, probability of L given D, I, G, and S. And here again, we have the probability of a variable L given its parent G and a bunch of non-descendants. So we can erase the non-descendants. And so altogether, that gives us exactly the expression that we wanted. And so now, again, by example, we proved that from these independent statements, we can derive the fact that P factorizes using the product rule for Bayesian networks. To summarize, we've provided 2 equivalent views of the graph structure. The first is the graph as a factorization, as a data structure that tells us how the distribution P can be broken up into pieces. So in this case, the fact that G allows P to be represented as a set of factors or CPDs over the network. The second is the IMAP view, the fact that the definition, that the structure of G encodes independencies that necessarily hold in P. And what we've shown is that each of these actually implies the other. Which means that if we have a distribution P that we know is represented as a Bayesian network over a certain graph, we can just look at the graph without even delving into the parameters, know certain independencies that have to hold in the distribution P. And independencies is a really valuable thing because it tells you something about what influences what, and if I observe something, what else might change. And that helps a lot in understanding the structure of the distribution and consequences of different types of observations. IMAP for P, which in a distribution, only that any independent. So now we can restate the theorem that we stated before. Before we talked about these separation properties, so now we can just give it a one concise statement. We can say that if P factorizes over G, that is, if it's representable as a Bayesian network over G, then G is an IMAP for P, which means I can read from G independencies that hold in P regardless of the parameters. Just by knowing that P factorizes over G. Interestingly, the converse of this theorem holds also. So this version of this theorem says that if G is an IMAP for P, then P factorizes over G. So what does that mean? It means that if the distribution satisfies the independence assumptions that are implicit in the graph, then we can take that distribution and represent it as a Bayesian network over that graph. So once again, let's do a proof by example. So now here we have the little graph assumptions. Satisfies these. What does that tell us? One is G1 that has D and I being separate variables, and the other is G2 that has an edge between D and I. So what independencies does G1 imply? What's an I of G1? Well, I of G1 is the independence that says D is independent of I, because there's no edges between them. What's I of G2? Well, I of G2 implies no independencies, because because D and I are connected by an edge and there's no other independencies that can be implied, and so I of G2 is the empty set. So what does that tell us? Let's look at the connection between these graphs and these two distributions. Is G1 an IMAP of P1? Well, if you look at P1, you can convince yourselves that P1 satisfies D is independent of I. G1 is an IMAP of P1. What about is G1 an IMAP of P2? Well, if we look at P2, we can again convince ourselves by examination that P2 doesn't satisfy D is independent of I. So the answer is no. This G1 is not an IMAP for P2. What about the other direction? What about G2? Well, G2 has no independence assumptions. And so it satisfies, and so both P1 and P2 satisfy the empty set of independence assumptions. As it happens, P1 also satisfies additional independence assumptions, but the definition of IMAP didn't require that, that a graph exactly represent the independencies in a distribution. Only that any independence that's implied by the graph holds for the distribution. And so we have that G2 is actually an IMAP for both P1 and P2. So now we can restate the theorem that we stated before. Both P1 and P2 satisfy this G1 is not an IMAP for P2. What about the other direction? What about G2? Well, G2 has no independence assumptions. And so it satisfies, and so both P1 and P2 satisfy the empty set of independence assumptions. As it happens, P1 also satisfies additional independence assumptions, but the definition of IMAP didn't require that, that a graph exactly represent the independencies in a distribution. Only that any independence that's implied by the graph holds for the distribution. And so we have that G2 is actually an IMAP for both P1 and P2. As it happens, P1 is satisfied. You can convince P1 statements, and those are the ones that the graph implies hold for distribution P. As we just showed in the previous theorem. So now we can give this a name. We're going to say that P, if P satisfies all of the independencies in G, then G is an IMAP of P. And map stands for independency map. What I of G, the independencies. So now the network over G satisfies the P factorizes over G. Interesting. Concise statement, we can say that if P factorizes over G, that is, if it's representable as a Bayesian network over G, then G is an IMAP for P, which means I can read from G independencies that hold in P regardless of the parameters. Just by knowing that P factorizes over G. Interestingly, the converse of this theorem holds also. So this version of the theorem says that if G is an IMAP for P, then P factorizes over G. So what does that mean? It means that if the distribution satisfies the independence assumptions that are implicit in the graph, then we can take that distribution and represent it as a Bayesian network over that graph, over G. Interestingly, the converse of this theorem holds also. So this version of the theorem says that if G is an IMAP for P, then P factorizes over G. So what does that mean? It means that if the distribution satisfies the independence assumptions that are implicit in the graph, then we can take that distribution and represent it as a Bayesian network over that graph. The independence assumptions that are implicit in the graph, then we can take that distribution, and if the distribution satisfies the independence assumptions that are implicit in the graph, then we can take that distribution and represent it as a Bayesian network over that graph. So once again, let's do a proof by example. So now here we have the little graph that we're going to use, and so now what do we know? We're going to write down the probability of the joint distribution over these 5 random variables using this expression, which is the chain rule for probabilities, not the chain rule for Bayesian networks, because we don't know yet that this is representable as a Bayesian network. We're going to write the chain rule for probabilities, and that has us writing it as P of D times P of I given D, which if you multiply the two together using the definition of conditional probability, so where do we use S is in I, G, and S statements? We can derive the fact that P, and by example, we proved this, And so altogether, that gives us exactly the expression that we wanted. And so now, again, by example, we proved this. We proved that from these independent statements, we can derive the fact that P factorizes using the product rule for Bayesian networks. Distribution P can be broken up into pieces. So in this case, the fact that G allows P to be represented as a set of factors or CPDs over the network. The second is the IMAP view, the fact that the definition, that the structure of G encodes independencies that necessarily hold in P. And what we've shown is that each of these actually implies the other. Which means that if we have a distribution P that we know is represented as a Bayesian network over a certain graph, we can just look at the graph without even delving into the parameters, know certain independencies that have to hold in the distribution P. And independencies is a really valuable thing because it tells you something about what influences what, and if I observe something, what else might change. And that helps a lot in understanding the structure of the distribution and consequences of different types of observations. One subclass of Bayesian networks is the class called as naive Bayes, or sometimes even more derogatory, idiot Bayes. As we'll see, naive Bayes models are called that way because they make independence assumptions that indeed are very naive and overly simplistic, and yet they provide an interesting point on the trade-off curve of model complexity that sometimes turns out to be surprisingly useful. So here is a naive Bayes model. This model is typically used for classification, that is taking an instance where we have effectively observed a bunch of features, and in most cases, although not necessarily, we're assuming that all of these features are observed for a given instance. And our goal is to infer to which class among the limited set of classes a particular instance belongs. So these are observed, these ones here are observed, and this one in general is hidden.
What independent assumption does the naive Bayes model make given all the each observed variable is independent to other observed ไม่ใช่ อ๋อใช่ given class ด้วยถูกไหม
Now, if you look at the assumptions made by this model makes the assumption that every pair of features, xi and xj, are conditionally independent given the class. So every xi and xj give us no information, one gives no information about the other once the class variable is observed. Which reduces this whole model into one where we only have to encode individual pairwise interactions. Between the class variable and single features. So if we look at the chain rule for Bayesian networks as applied in this context, we see that we have a joint distribution, P of C comma x1 up to xn, which can be written using a product form as a prior over the class variable C, and a product of the conditional probabilities of each feature given the class. To understand this model a little bit better, it helps also to look at the ratio between the probabilities of two different classes given a particular observation, that is a particular assignment x1 up to xn to the observed features. So if we look at this ratio, we can see that it can be broken down as a product of two terms. The first is just the ratio of the prior probabilities of the two classes. So that's the green term here. And the second is this blue term, which is a product of odds ratios, as it's called. That is the probability of seeing a particular observation xi in the context of one class relative to the context of the other class. So let's look at an application of the naive Bayes model in one of the places where it's actually very commonly used, which is the context of text classification. So imagine that we're trying to take a document and figure out for that document to which category it belongs. We have some set of categories in mind. So for example, is this a document about pets? Is it about finance? Is it about vacations? We have some set of categories and we'd like to assign a document to one of those. It turns out that one can use two different naive Bayes models for tackling this problem. The first of those is called the Bernoulli naive Bayes model for text. And it treats every word in a dictionary. So you open your dictionary and there's several, maybe 10,000 words in that dictionary. And so you have a random variable for every one of those words, or at least the ones that occur in the kind of document that you're interested in thinking about. And for each word in the dictionary, we have a binary random variable, which is 1 if the word appears in the document, and 0 otherwise. So if we have, say, 5,000 words that we're interested in reasoning about, we would have 5,000 of these binary variables. And so the probability associated, the CPD associated with each variable is, in this case, the probability that the word appears, say the probability that the word cat appears given the label of the document. So for example, if we had two categories that we're looking at right now, say documents about finances versus a document about pets, you would expect that in a document about pets, the word cat is quite likely to appear. And so I'm only showing the probability of cat appearing. The probability of cat not appearing would be 0.7. The probability that dog appears might be 0.4, and so on. Whereas for a document about finances, we're much less likely to see the word cat and dog, but are more likely to have the words buy and sell. So the probability that buy appears might be considerably higher in this case. So this is a Bernoulli naive Bayes model because first it's a Bernoulli model because each of these is a binary variable subject to a Bernoulli distribution. So this is a Bernoulli distribution. And it's naive Bayes because it makes very strong independence assumptions that the probability of one word appearing is independent of, the event of one word appearing is independent of the event of a different word appearing given that we know the class. And obviously that assumption is far too strong to be representative of reality, but it turns out to be a not bad approximation in terms of actual performance. A second model for the same problem is what's called the multinomial naive Bayes model for text. In this case, the variables that represent the features are not the words in the dictionary, but rather words in the document. So here n is the length of the document. If you have a document that has 737 words, you're going to have 737 random variables. And the value of each of these random variables is the actual word that is in the first, second, up to the nth position in the document. And so if we have, say, that same dictionary of 5,000 possible words, this is no longer a binary random variable, but rather one that has d values where this is the size of the dictionary, say 5,000. Now, this might seem like a very complicated model because the CPD now needs to specify the probability distribution over words in the dictionary for every possible word, very possible position in the document. So we need to have a probability distribution over the words in position 1, in position 2, and in position n, but we're going to address that by assuming that these probability distributions are all the same. And so the probability distribution for over words in position 1 is the same as for words in position 2, 3, and so on. Now, this is a multinomial naive Bayes model because notice that the parameterization of that approximation document. So here n is the length of the document. If you have a document that has 737 words, you're going to have 737 random variables, and the value of each of these random variables is the actual word that is in the first, second, up to the nth position in the document. And so if we have, say, that same dictionary of 5,000 possible words, this is no longer a binary random variable, but rather one that has d values where this is the size of the dictionary, say 5,000. Now, this might seem like a very complicated variable, but rather one that has d values where this is the size of the dictionary, say 5,000. Now, this might seem like a very complicated model because the CPD now needs to specify the probability distribution over words in the dictionary for every possible word, very possible position in the document. So we need to have a probability distribution over the words in position 1, in position 2, and in position n, but we're going to address that by assuming that these probability distributions are all the same. And so the probability distribution for over words in position 1 is the same as for words in position 2, 3, and so on. Now, this is a multinomial naive Bayes model because notice that the parameterization for each of these words is a multinomial distribution. So what we see here is not the same as what we saw in the previous slide, where we had a bunch of binary random variables. Here, this is a multinomial, which means that all of these entries sum to 1. And it's a naive Bayes model because it makes, again, a strong independence assumption, a different independence assumption. In this case, it makes the assumption that the word in position 1 is independent of the word in position 2, given the class variable. And once again, if you think about, say, two-word phrases that are common, this assumption is clearly overly strong, and yet it appears to be a good approximation in a variety of practical applications, and most notably in the case of this kind of document classification where it's still quite commonly used. So to summarize, the approximation, word in position 2. And it's a naive Bayes model because it makes, again, a strong independence assumption, a different independence assumption. In this case, it makes the assumption that the word in position 1 is independent of the word in position 2, given the class variable. And once again, if you think about, say, two-word phrases that are common, this assumption is clearly overly strong, and yet it appears to be a good approximation in a variety of practical applications, and most notably in the case of this kind of document classification where it's still quite commonly used. So to summarize, naive Bayes actually provides us with a very simple approach for classification problems. It's computationally very efficient, and the models are easy to construct, whether by hand or by machine learning techniques. It turns out to be a surprisingly effective method in domains that have a large number of weakly relevant features, such as the text domains that we talked about. On the other hand, the strong independence assumptions that we talked about, the conditional independence of the different features given the class, reduce the performance of these models, especially in cases where we have multiple highly correlated features.
โอเคทำโจทย์ต่อครับทำโจทย์ยามเที่ยงคืน Which pair of variables are independent in the graphical model below given that none of them have been observed? You may select one or more options. A B ไงไม่มีเว้ย C D ไงเอ้ยไม่ใช่ C D อะไรอีกัน A D ได้ไหม A ส่งผลต่อ C ไม่ส่งผลต่อ B โอเค A D ได้ D E อ่ะ D ส่งผลต่อ B ส่งผลต่อ C ส่งผลต่อ E ไม่ได้ A C อ่ะ A ส่งผล A E independency in the graph อันนี้ challenging นะครับเขาจงภูมิใจซะนะ now assume the value e ไม่รู้รู้ observe ที่เหลือไม่ observe which pair of variable not including e are independent in the same graphical model given e โอเคอุ๊ยเยอะจัง a b อ่ะ a b independent ไหมถ้ารู้ e ถ้ารู้ e ปุ๊บ a ก็รู้ใช่ไหม c อ้าวนี่เป็นลูกของ c นี่เพราะงั้นอันนี้มัน v activate b dependent กัน a b independent ไม่ independent a c ไม่แน่นอนถูกไหม a d ก็ไม่ถูกไหมเพราะวันนี้มันทางนี้แล้วถูกไหม b d ล่ะไม่อยู่แล้วถูกไหม d c ล่ะก็ไม่ถูกไหมเพราะ e มันส่งผลต่อ c แล้วพอ c มันนั่นแล้วปุ๊บมันก็จะส่งผลต่อ b และส่งผลต่อ d แล้ว b c ล่ะไม่ถูกไหมนั่น IMAP can also be defined directly on graph as follow let Ig be the set of independency encoded by a graph G Ig เป็น set of independency encoded by graph G โอเคตามนั้น G1 เป็น IMAP for G2 if Ig1 เป็น subset ของ Ig2 อันนี้ไม่ใช่ยากเว้ยกราฟ K เป็น is an IMAP for graph G if and only if all the dependency encoded K are also encoded by G กราฟ K เป็น IMAP for graph G imap เป็นฟังก์ชัน f that map a graph T to itself อะไรของมันวะ graph K is same of graph except K that is the same as the graph G except that all the edges are already โอ้จริงเหรอวะไม่จริงดิมั่วแล้ว naive Bayes following naive Bayes model for full diagnosis population 10,000 คน อะไรที่ true ในโมเดลนี้ ถ้าเราบอกว่า1,000 คนมีฟลูก็1 ใน 10เนาะ500 ปวดหัว500 เป็นไข้ก็ไข้กับปวดหัว independent กันถูกไหมถูก1,000 คนปวดหัว500 เป็นฟลูขอโน้ตหน่อยแล้วกันนะฟลูเป็นอะไรบ้างนะฟีเวอร์ฟาทีกคัฟเฮดเอ sore throat muscle ache ไม่จำเป็นนะนี่เนี่ยไม่ค่อยเข้าใจเรื่อง IMAP เท่าไหร่เนาะอยากจะเข้าใจมัน ก็เห็นเขียนว่า G เป็น Bayesian network
most common applications of Bayesian networks, or rather one of the earliest ones that are still very much in use today, is for the purpose of diagnosis. And by diagnosis, I mean both medical as well as fault diagnosis. Now, this dates back into the early 90s in the PhD thesis of Heckerman et al. Won the ACM Dissertation Award in a system called Pathfinder, which looked at a range of different pieces of evidence in order to help a doctor diagnose a set of diseases. And specifically, it was focused initially, at least, on lymph node pathology, so 60 different diseases, all sorts of different symptoms. And they tried out a bunch of different methods for solving this problem. So the first one they actually tried, this was way back in the early days of artificial intelligence, before Bayesian networks were in common use, and they tried a rule-based system. And it didn't work really well. The second version of Pathfinder used the naive Bayes model, which assumes that all of the symptoms are independent given the disease. And even that really simple model got superior performance to the rule-based system that they initially tried. Pathfinder 3 still used naive Bayes, but it used naive Bayes with better knowledge engineering. That is, they actually understood some of the issues behind what makes a system like this work well, and they fixed it. So specifically, one of the things that turns out to be really fundamental for the performance of any probabilistic model system is not to put in zero probabilities ever, except for things that are definite.
What is the main reason that using 0 probability can be problematic? คูณกันได้0ก็ได้0สิครับ
Because once you put in a zero, no matter how much evidence to the contrary you have, you will never ever be able to get rid of it, because anything times zero is still zero. And so here in the initial Pathfinder 2, they put in some incorrect zero probabilities for things that were very unlikely but not impossible, and it turns out that that gave rise to about 10% of incorrect diagnoses of the system. They also did better calibration of conditional probabilities, which turns out to be important for knowledge engineering of a Bayesian network. So, for example, it turns out that it's a lot easier to compare for a physician to compare the probability of a finding, a piece of evidence, between two diseases, as opposed to the probability of two different findings within a single disease. It's much easier to say, oh, this is much more likely in this context than in that context. And it turns out that when they asked the physician to calibrate this way, they got much better estimates of the probabilities. Now, mind you, this was way before they had learning, so it was all hand-constructed. They asked the physician to calibrate this way, they got much better estimates of the probabilities. Now, mind you, this was way before they had learning, so it was all hand-constructed. And then finally, Pathfinder 4 was the full Bayesian network in all of its full glory. It no longer made incorrect assumptions about independencies between different, say, symptoms given a disease. And that both allowed them to make the model more correct, and also it turns out it is an unexpected side effect by allowing, say, a symptom variable to have more parents. than just a single disease variable, it actually gave rise to considerably more accurate estimation of the probabilities because the doctor could kind of think about different cases and didn't have to average them all out in his head. And this is one of the, I think, really compelling aspects of Bayesian network models, which is that the Bayesian network model actually turned out to agree with the experts in an expert panel of physicians in 50 out of the 53 cases. And these were hard cases. These were ones that you really needed the experts' opinions on. It wasn't one that just an average doctor could necessarily diagnose correctly. And this is as compared to 47 out of 53 for the naive Bayes model and significantly less than that for the rule-based system. Mind you, and this is an interesting and important aspect, is that the Bayesian network actually outperformed the physicians who designed the model. And I mean, it didn't outperform the expert panel, but it performed the physician who designed it because it was better at putting together all these different numbers in a way that a doctor just can't fit all these different findings into his or her brain at the same time. So we talked about the CPCS network. It's one of my favorite networks because it's kind of big and hairy and sort of kind of scary to look at. But anyway, the actual number of variables in this network is about 500. And each of them has, on average, about 4 values. So the total number of parameters, if you were to specify a full joint distribution, is 4 to 500. So that's it's about 4 to the 500, or 2 to the power of 1,000, which is more than the number of atoms in the universe. So obviously, one couldn't specify this as a complete joint distribution, not to mention that the probability of each and every one of these is as close to 0 as makes no difference, because it's the probability of 500 different. I mean, it's an event involving 500 variables. If you were to actually construct a CPD for each one of these variables, the number of parameters would be about 133 million, which is considerably better than 2 to the 1,000, but still much too large. And so it turns out that they made additional simplifying assumptions that we'll talk about later on that allowed them to avoid a complete table representation of the CPDs and rather do a more compact one, and that gave rise to about 8,000 parameters, which is still a lot, but actually is tractable to deal with. So we already talked about the fact that these medical diagnosis systems have emerged from research, and Microsoft built a medical diagnosis system. Various other people have built one as well. This has been a little bit slow on the uptake in the medical field because it doesn't fit naturally into a physician's pipeline. Maybe now with the advent of electronic health records, there will be more data entered into the computer, so these systems will be in more common use. But until very recently, most doctors just wrote stuff down on paper, and so it was very difficult to put this into the standard production pipeline for diagnosis. And then finally, fault diagnosis has been a much more direct application of these systems, because we don't have an issue of how doctors typically do their diagnostic pipeline. So within the Windows operating system, there's thousands of these little troubleshooters that help you diagnose problems with your printer, with Excel, with your email, and each of these has a little Bayesian network inside that answers probability questions given observations about what the system about the model involving, in this case, for example, the printer. And there's also a big website out there that does car repair, and you put in the make and model and year of the car and what are the main problems with it, and it figures it out and tells you what to look at and what the most likely complaint is. And the reason behind the benefits of this, people don't use Bayesian networks for this just because Bayesian networks are cool, even though they are. They use this because it provides a very flexible user interface for the user, You instantiate the evidence in the Bayesian network, out comes a probability. You don't want to answer the question right now, that's okay, you can answer it later. It just means that it's an observation that you didn't get the condition on. And then for the designer, this type of system is really easy to design and maintain. Because if, for example, something changes a little bit in your printer structure, if you were to design a standard menu-based system, you would have to go and rebuild the entire tree that asks, you know, that decides what is the first question to ask, and what is the second question to ask, and what is the most likely diagnosis. Here, in the Bayesian network, you change one probability, maybe add an edge, and everything just emerges from that in a very straightforward way. So it's much more modular and more maintainable than a hardwired menu-based system. And that's what the people who use these systems will tell you. That's why they chose this path as opposed to the hardwired methodology. So now let's look at an example of an actual network and try to see what the CPDs look like, what behavior we get, and how we might augment the network to include additional things. Now let me warn you right up front that this is a baby network. It's not a real network, but it's one that's useful to, it's compact enough to look at, but still interesting enough to get some non-trivial behaviors. So to explore the network, we're going to use a system called SAM-IAM. It was produced by Adnan Darwish and his group at UCLA, and it's nice because it actually works on all sorts of different platforms, so it's usable by pretty much everyone. So let's look at a particular problem. Imagine that we're an insurance company, and we're trying to decide for a person who comes into the door whether to give them insurance or not. So the operative aspect of making that decision is how much the policy is going to cost us. That is, how much we're going to have to pay over the course of a year to insure this person. So so there is a variable called cost. Let's click on that to see what properties that variable has, and we can see that in this case we've decided to only give two values to the cost variable, low and high. This is clearly a very coarse-grained approximation and not one that we would use in practice. In reality, we would probably have this be a continuous variable whose mean depends on various aspects of the model. But for the purposes of illustration, we're going to use this discrete distribution that only has two values, low and high. Okay, so now let's build up this network using the technique of expanding the conversation that we've discussed before. And so what is the most important determining factor as to the cost that the insurance company has to pay? Well, probably whether the person has accidents and how severe they are. So here we have a network that has two variables. One is accident and one is cost. And in this case, we've decided to select three possible values for the accident variable: none, mild, and severe, and with the percentages that you see, with the probabilities that you see listed. And what you see down below is the cost variable, and let's open the CPD of the cost variable given the accident variable, and we can see that in this case we have a conditional probability table of accident given, cost given accident. Note that this is actually inverted from the notation that we've used in the class before, because here the conditioning cases are columns, whereas in the examples that we've given there have been rows. But that's okay, the same thing, it's the same thing, just inverted. And so we see, for example, that if the person has no accident, the costs are very likely to be very low. Mild accidents incur different distribution over costs, and severe accidents have a probability of 0.9 of having high cost and 0.1 of having low cost. So now let's continue extending the conversation and ask what accident depends on. And it seems that one of the obvious factors is whether the person is a good driver or not, and so we would expect driver quality to be apparent of accident. But there's other things that also affect not just the presence of an accident, but also the severity of the accident. So for example, vehicle size would affect both the severity of an accident, because if you're driving a large SUV, then chances are you're not likely to be in an accident that's as severe, but it might also perhaps increase the chance of having an accident overall, because of maybe driving a large car is harder to handle. And then vehicle year might affect the chances of an accident because of the presence or absence of certain safety features like anti-lock brakes and airbags. So let's open the CPD of accidents and see what that looks like now that we have all these parents for it. And we can see here that we have these, in this case, 8 conditioning cases, which correspond to the 3 variables, 2 values each. And so here, just to look at one of the sample, just as an example distribution, for example, so if this is a fairly new vehicle after 2000 and it's an SUV, the probability of having a severe accident is quite low, the probability of having a mild accident is moderate, and the probability of having no accident is 0.85, whereas if you compare that to the corresponding entry when we keep everything fixed except that now it's a compact car, we see that the probability of having a mild accident is lower, but the probability of having no accident is higher, representing different driving patterns, for example. Okay, so with this network, we can now start asking simple questions. So let's do some example of causal inference. Let's instantiate, for example, driving quality to be good and bad, and we can see that for a bad driver, the probability of cost is 81, of low cost is 80, and the probability is hundreds of thousands. That's not going. And let's go ahead and introduce that variable. So you can click on this button that allows us to create a node. The node is now called variable 1, so we have to give it a name. So, for example, we're going to call it driving history. And that's his identifier, and we also have the name of the variable, which is usually the same. And let's make that 2 values, say previous accident and no previous accident. Now, where would we place this variable in the network? One might initially think that the right thing to do is to place driving history as a parent of driver quality, because if we observe, because driving history can influence our beliefs about driver quality. Now, it's true that observing driving history changes our probability in driver quality, but if you think about the actual causal structure of this scenario, what we actually have is that driver quality is a causal factor of both a previous accident as well as a subsequent accident. And so if we want to maintain the intuitive causal structure of the domain, a more appropriate thing is to add driving history as a child rather than a parent of driver quality. They might question why it matters, and in this very simple example, the 2 models are in some sense equivalent, and we could have placed it either way, except that the CPD for driver quality given driving history might be a little bit less intuitive. But if we had other indicators of driver quality, for example, previous moving violations, then it actually makes a lot more sense to have all of these be children of driver quality as opposed to parents of driver quality. Okay, so that shows us how we would add a variable into the network. And now let's go and open up a much larger network that includes these variables as well as others. So let's look now at this larger network, and we can see that we've. Now, where would we place this variable in the network? One, the parent of driver quality, because if we observe, because driving history can influence our beliefs about driver quality. Now, it's true that observing driving history changes our probability in driver quality, but if you think about the actual causal structure of this scenario, what we actually have is that driver quality is a causal factor of both a previous accident as well as a subsequent accident. And so if we want to maintain the intuitive causal structure of the domain, a more appropriate thing is to add driving history as a child rather than a parent of driver quality. They might question why it matters, and in this very simple example, the two models are in some sense equivalent, and we could have placed it either way, except that the CPD for driver quality given driving history might be a little bit less intuitive. But if we had other indicators of driver quality, for example, previous moving violations, then it actually makes a lot more sense to have all of these be children of driver quality as opposed to parents of driver quality. Okay, so that shows us how we would add a variable into the network. And now let's go and open up a much larger network that includes these variables as well as others. So let's look now at this larger network, and we can see that we've added several different variables to the network. We've added attributes of the vehicle, for example, whether the vehicle has anti-lock brakes and an airbag, which is going to allow us to give more informative probabilities regarding the accident. We've also introduced aspects of the driver, for example, whether they've had extra training, which is going to increase driving quality, whether they're young or old, where the presumption is that younger people tend to be more reckless drivers, and whether the driver is focused or more easily distracted, which again is going to affect driving quality. Now, since personality types is hard to observe, we added another variable, which is a good student, which might indicate one's personality type. So let's open the CPD for that one. And so we can see here that, for example, if you are a focused person who is young, you're much more likely to be a good student, much more so than if you are not a focused person who's young. If you're old, you're just not very likely to be a student, and so this probability is basically says that if you're old, you're just not very likely to be a student, and therefore not likely to be a good student. So now that we've added all these variables to the network, let's go ahead and run a few queries to see what happens. And let's start by looking at the prior probability of accident before we observe anything. So we can see that the probability of no accident is about 79.5%. The probability of severe accident is about 3%. Now let's go ahead and tell the system that we have a good student in hand. So we're going to observe that the student is a good student, and let's see what happens. We can see, surprisingly, that even though we observe that somebody is a good student, the probability of no accident went down from 79.5% to 78%, and the probability of severe accident went up to 3.5% to 3.67%. You might say, well, but I told you that it's a good student. Shouldn't the probability of accidents go down? So let's look at some active trails in this graph. One active trail goes from good student to focused, to driver quality, to accident. And sure enough, that trail, if we consider that trail in isolation, is probably going to make the probability of no accident be higher. But we have another active trail. We have the active trail that goes from good student up to age, and then back down through driver quality. So to see that, let's unclick on good students and see what happens. Note that the probability initially that the driver is young was 25%, but then when I observed good students, it went up to close to 95%. And that was enough to counteract the influence along this more obvious active trail. So to demonstrate that this is indeed what's going on, let's click on the fact and instantiate the fact that the student is young. And we can see that the probability of severe accident went up to 3.7%, and no accident went down to a little bit shy of 77%. And now let's observe good student and see what happens. So now we observe good student, and the probability of no accident went down to 78%. As opposed to before when it was 77%. Now, and the reason for that is that we've now blocked this trail that goes from good student through age to driver to before when it was 77. And the probability of no accident went down to 78%, as opposed to before when it was 77%. Now, and the reason for that is that we've now blocked this trail that goes from good student through age to driver quality by observing this variable which blocks the trail. So we can see the reasoning patterns in a Bayesian network are sometimes subtle, and there are different trails that can affect things and interact with each other in different ways. And so it's useful to take a model and play around with different queries and different combinations of evidence to understand the behavior of a network. And especially if you're designing such a network for a particular application, it's useful to try out these different queries and see if the behavior that you get is the behavior that you want to get. And if not, then you need to think back about how do I modify this network to get behavior that's more analogous to the desired behavior. This network is available for you to play with, and you can try out different things and see what behaviors you get.
ว้พรุ่งนี้แล้วกันนะครับ จบดีกว่าโอเคแค่นี้ก่อนดีกว่านี้มาต่อตรงนี้ให้หมดก็น่าจะใช้เวลาเท่าไหร่30 45 ชั่วโมงหนึ่งชั่วโมงครึ่งประมาณชั่วโมงครึ่งก็น่าจะจบ